Imagine waking up one day to the unsettling realization that your feelings are not entirely your own. What if the unease in your chest and the doubts in your mind were planted there by someone else, with quiet words, subtle gestures, or silent expectations? This book is not just another manual on being assertive. It is a revealing journey into the shadowy world of guilt manipulation, exposing how psychological control hides in everyday exchanges and relationships. As you turn these pages, prepare to see familiar situations with new eyes and to reclaim a sense of truth and freedom that belongs only to you. Boundaries Matter: Overcoming Guilt Manipulation, written and published by Stealth Psychology. Chapter 1: Spotting Guilt When It Shows. Sarah sits at her kitchen table on a rainy evening, staring at her phone. Her friend's message reads, "I guess I shouldn't have expected you to care enough to show up today. But that's just me hoping for too much, right?" Even though Sarah missed the gathering because of a last-minute family emergency, a slow wave of guilt washes over her. Somewhere deep down, she feels she failed as a friend. Already, she is planning an elaborate apology and wondering if she will ever do enough to make it right. Yet, what Sarah doesn't see is that these guilt-laden messages arrive every time she cannot be immediately available. What on the surface looks like a small emotional reaction is in fact a recurring pattern, a psychological lever, expertly pulled. This is guilt manipulation at its most insidious, subtle, intimate, woven neatly through the fabric of relationships. A manipulator's ultimate goal is to create invisible strings, ensnaring their targets until their thoughts, emotions, and choices are shaped by someone else's desires. Sometimes the aim is emotional control, reducing another's sense of self. Other times, the target is far more concrete, persuading someone to loan money repeatedly or bending their will with a calculated plea for sympathy. Long before the victim realizes what's happening, loyalty becomes a weapon, and obligation feels like a bottomless pit. Most of us want to believe we are too shrewd or independent to be manipulated, but the truth is that guilt works precisely because it operates out of sight. It is the quietest of commands, spoken between lines and hidden behind sighs or downcast eyes. When you are faced with someone you care about, implying you've disappointed them, you bend, not out of rational calculation, but from a profound discomfort that pulls at your heart. The manipulator does not rage or insist. They merely question, withdraw, or hint. These repeated episodes rarely set off alarms. In fact, the techniques thrive on subtlety. Compliance is extracted not by force, but by the shaming glow of unspoken disappointment or conditional affection. Victims, more often than not, only see the full scope of their entrapment long after the damage is done. The initial exchanges might seem harmless, understandable even, especially among people who genuinely care for one another. However, the insidious nature of guilt manipulation means that each presented disappointment or minor accusation becomes a brick in an unseen wall, one that gradually closes off freedom, leaving the victim wondering how much of their life, energy, and happiness are truly their own. By the time they wake up to the depth of their discomfort and the reality of their compromise, the walls have already narrowed, and escape feels uncertain or impossible. Recognizing guilt, as it shows up in your relationships, can feel like uncovering a disturbing secret. Behind everyday words and gestures, there can lurk a hidden force intent on tipping the emotional scales in one direction. Just because the chains are invisible does not mean they're not tightly wound. To spot guilt in action is to reclaim a vital sense of autonomy, a first urgent step toward breaking cycles that too often remain in the shadows. When guilt is whipped up and wielded as a subtle tool of control, its impact runs far deeper than most people expect. Emotions are the first domain to be affected, often before the mind even grasps what is happening. People on the receiving end develop a constant undercurrent of anxiety, an ever-present sense that whatever they do might let someone down in ways they never intended. The manipulator thrives on this discomfort. In one documented case, a college student named Tyler recounted how his roommate would routinely express disappointment about Tyler spending time with other friends or focusing too much on coursework. While these were typical, healthy choices for a young adult, the roommate's disappointed sighs and pointed silences sent a clear message: "You're letting me down." Tyler found himself reshuffling plans, losing sleep, even neglecting his studies, all in an attempt to restore what felt like lost harmony. What at first appeared to be courtesy quickly morphed into a pattern that dictated his daily life. Decision-making is compromised when guilt manipulation is present, carving invisible detours in a person's reasoning. Instead of making choices based on their own needs, values, or logical priorities, victims make decisions to ease that uncomfortable tension. Research published in the journal Personality and Social Psychology Review shows that people under the sway of relational guilt are much more likely to concede to requests, even unreasonable ones, simply to stave off disapproval or withdrawal. An employee might agree to work unpaid overtime because a supervisor frames it as a test of loyalty. A parent might fund an adult child's unnecessary expenses simply because not doing so is twisted into a sign of not loving them enough. The manipulator's greatest strength lies in clouding the victim's own compass until it barely points to true north. Relationships themselves buckle under the repeated pressure of guilt manipulation. Interactions lose their authenticity as the manipulated partner begins to second-guess every word and action. Love and companionship are replaced by obligation or quiet resentment. In a qualitative analysis of family dynamics, researchers noted that chronic guilt-based influence led not to closeness but to bitterness, communication breakdowns, and ultimately estrangement. Control masquerading as care creates a festering wound, not connection. Self-esteem is perhaps the quietest casualty. Each time a manipulated person abandons their needs, dreams, or beliefs to appease someone else, an internal tally is quietly updated. The manipulator's approval appears vital, and every misstep feels like evidence of a deeper flaw. Caught in this cycle, victims question their worth, their competence, and their goodness, which can lead to even greater dependence on those who exploit their guilt. This devastating spiral is why guilt-based manipulation has been found in studies to correlate with long-term issues like depression, chronic anxiety, and reduced ability to assert one's boundaries later in life. Why do people fall for it, even when it has such corrosive effects? The answer runs deep. For most, guilt is rooted in a desire to be good and loved. Manipulators, consciously or unconsciously, weaponize this basic human urge. Whether through a parent's heavy-handed reminders of sacrifices made, or a partner's subtle hints that no one else would put up with this, guilt becomes nearly impossible to ignore. The longing for acceptance overpowers the fleeting, gut-level awareness that something is wrong. The pain and consequences of falling prey to guilt manipulation are urgent reminders that the risk is real and often unseen, making it crucial to recognize when it's happening. Understanding the effects is only the beginning. In the next part, the most elusive warning signs, the veiled red flags that most people overlook, will be brought to light. Skilled manipulators do not choose their targets at random. They look for certain vulnerabilities, traits like compassion, loyalty, a generous nature, or the deeply rooted desire to please. Often these qualities are celebrated in our culture as evidence of good character, but in the hands of someone skilled at guilt manipulation, these very traits become entry points for influence and control. Manipulators observe carefully. They may start with small tests to gauge how someone responds to disappointment or subtle injustice. Does the person backtrack when accused of minor faults? Does their demeanor soften when someone else expresses discomfort or neediness? These initial probes are not accidental. They are calculated to reveal how easily guilt can be implanted in the target's heart and mind. Take, for example, the story of Michael, a conscientious employee in his first professional job. Early on, his manager sang his praises and hinted at the company's need for team players willing to put the company first. When Michael hesitated to work late one evening, his manager recounted how previous employees had gone above and beyond, suggesting that Michael's dedication would benefit not just himself but the whole team. Subtly, a connection was drawn between sacrifice and belonging, leveraging Michael's sense of obligation. Over time, Michael found himself staying late more often, apologizing instantly if he had to put his own needs first, and feeling a persistent weight when he considered taking lunch breaks or leaving on time. Gradually, the lines between voluntary commitment and coerced sacrifice blurred. The manager, attuned to Michael's anxious desire to be a good team player, adjusted his tactics with each new request, reinforcing guilt with every carefully selected word and lingering glance. In another scenario, consider Elise, whose mother frequently reminds her of all the things she's done for her since childhood. Whenever Elise suggests a plan that doesn't directly involve her mother, be it travel, work, or spending time with others, her mother sighs deeply, reeling off a list of sacrifices she made. On the surface, these are recollections of care, but underneath, sly appeals are being made. After everything I have given up for you, how could you? Elise, despite being independent in many ways, begins to fold each new desire under a rising wave of discomfort and obligation. She second-guesses herself, edits her dreams, and ultimately shapes her future to fit her mother's subtle expectations. The psychological shift is slow but relentless. Guilt becomes Elise's default emotional response around her mother, guiding decisions and silencing her true wants. With each scenario, the internal changes are often imperceptible at first. The manipulated person finds their thoughts drifting to how they can restore harmony. They preemptively alter behavior, apologize for imaginary wrongs, or suppress their own needs to avoid disapproval. The manipulator's power grows, hidden beneath kindness or concern. Detachment from one's own instincts develops, replaced by an anxious hyper-awareness of the other person's moods and reactions. This breaking and reshaping of the self is gradual but profound, building a trap that tightens each time guilt is successfully invoked. Recognizing the patterns by which targets are selected and controlled is the essential foundation for self-defense. Understanding the calculated moves and internal shifts dismantles the illusion that manipulation is random or inescapable. In the journey toward reclaiming autonomy, grasping these tactics is the vital first step. The path ahead will dive deeper into how this subtle game escalates, revealing the haunting cycles that leave so many feeling powerless, until the truth is confronted and resistance begins to take shape. Chapter 2. What Healthy Boundaries Look Like. Olivia believed she was generous to a fault, always going out of her way for her friends, giving more than she ever received. Her energy was spent in small, unnoticed sacrifices, from dropping everything at a moment's notice for a friend in need, to consistently lending money she wouldn't expect returned, to making endless allowances for others' moods or mistakes. She thought her kindness was reciprocated, until one rainy Sunday afternoon when she finally, timidly, declined a friend's request to come over and talk after a long, exhausting week. The friend's tone shifted at once. Guilt oozed through subtle remarks and side replies, clever comments about Olivia never really being there when it matters. By the end of the conversation, Olivia found herself apologizing repeatedly, wrestling with a deep sense of regret, and overcompensating in following days with more favors and invitations. In Olivia's story lies the silent reality for countless others, the slow, numbing entrapment that emerges when there are no clear boundaries to defend the self. The manipulator in this scenario is not necessarily overtly cruel or dramatic. Often they drift in the haze of closeness, sometimes as a partner, a parent, a colleague, or a longtime friend. Their ultimate goal may be emotional control, securing a place at the center of another's priorities, or establishing a dynamic in which they can always count on being comforted, supported, or indulged. More cunningly, such manipulation sometimes conceals other aims, smoothing financial exploitation by establishing guilt, fostering social isolation by guilt-tripping targets for wanting time with others, or drawing lines of compliance so subtle that their existence goes unnoticed. Here, each incident is discrete, and each discomfort easily rationalized. Most victims, like Olivia, don't see themselves as being manipulated at all. They simply see themselves as being good, striving harder and harder to meet invisible standards that are always just an inch out of reach. Without healthy boundaries, the cycle repeats unchecked. The victim remains trapped in a system that rewards endless giving and weaponizes normal fatigue or individual needs as proof of failure or selfishness. So effective is the subtlety with which a manipulator operates that many never fully recognize what is happening until they are suffering from exhaustion, bitterness, or an unspoken resentment that poisons even good intentions. Guilt becomes a constant background noise, and the idea of saying no, taking time for oneself, or confronting unfairness feels like a betrayal, both of others and the kind identity the victim has built over years. The cost of lacking boundaries is never paid all at once. Rather, it drips slowly into daily life. The quiet resentment, the anxiety of disappointing others, the blank spaces where self-care should exist, the feeling of emptiness after giving everything without return. Eventually, there comes a moment, often too late, when the victim catches a faint glimpse of freedom in the distance, a realization of what has been lost and how much has gone unnoticed and unprotected. In these quiet moments, the hidden truth shimmers into view. Life without boundaries is life on someone else's terms, built from invisible debts that can never be truly repaid. Recognizing this, the journey toward healthier, more honest boundaries can finally begin, with a new understanding of what is at stake and what is to be reclaimed. Life without healthy boundaries weathers souls slowly, quietly diminishing emotional resilience and blurring essential sense of worth. The emotional impact is subtle at first. Persistent unease, guilt, and fatigue become nearly constant companions. A study in the Journal of Behavioral Science illustrates how individuals with weakened boundaries report significantly higher rates of anxiety and depression. Their emotional health corrodes under the weight of everyone else's demands and expectations. Tammy, a middle manager in a busy office, provides a striking example. Year after year, she accepted every additional assignment her supervisor passed on to her, never daring to refuse or negotiate. Her anxiety blossomed with each accommodation, her private time shrank, and she learned to dread her email inbox as it brought new demands. The fear of disappointing her boss or being deemed difficult outpaced any healthy concern for her own well-being. Slowly, emotional exhaustion became her routine, and she stopped feeling joy about her work or anything else. Decision-making erodes next, as every choice is haunted by a looming anxiety. Will this upset someone? Will I be made to feel selfish or uncaring? The absence of boundaries warps the decision-maker's lens, transforming even simple preferences into moral dilemmas. Friends might pressure Jamie to always host gatherings, leveraging Jamie's reluctance to say no. At first, Jamie reasons that it is only fair. After all, being generous feels good. Yet as months slip by and the burden grows heavier, Jamie's inner dialogue becomes a constant calculation of how each answer might trigger guilt or disappointment. Evidence abounds in psychological research that chronic exposure to such patterns condemns victims to a cycle of indecisiveness, avoidance, and resentment. They second-guess their own needs and hesitate to trust themselves even when faced with minor choices. The damage continues to ripple through relationships. Bonds that once felt comforting now feel transactional, measured by hidden ledgers of favors given and received. In a well-documented longitudinal study, psychologist Dr. John H. Gagnon followed couples over a decade and observed a recurring theme. Couples lacking clear personal boundaries developed deep, simmering resentment. One partner would always give in, avoid conflict, or stifle legitimate feelings. Slowly, love decayed into obligation and quiet bitterness. The pattern was clear. Relationships rot from within when personal boundaries are sacrificed, leading to distance, mistrust, and a subtle sense of being trapped. At its root, this chronic overcompliance robs self-esteem. Victims slowly begin to internalize the message that their own needs matter least. Molly, once an outgoing and confident woman, stopped pursuing her interests and even lost touch with friends, finding herself unable to say no when her partner hinted at disapproval. Each time she deferred her desires to preserve peace, her conviction and confidence shrank, leaving only the echo of self-doubt in their place. This outcome is as intentional as it is tragic. Manipulators subtly groom their targets to doubt their right to have boundaries at all. The result is a gradual extinction of self-trust and autonomy, undermining any attempts at honest self-expression. People fall so easily into these roles because society venerates sacrifice, cooperation, and being the bigger person. Manipulators exploit this, carefully packaging their demands in moral language or appeals to loyalty and love. Most victims are simply trying to do right by others, unaware that the cost is their own diminishing self until dependency, anxiety, and bitterness are all that remain. Recognizing these harms is the first urgent step toward change. But the evidence of manipulation is not always obvious or loud. In the next part, the subtle warning signs that often pass unnoticed, yet truly mark the erosion of healthy boundaries, will be unmasked. Manipulators searching for the absence of healthy boundaries often have a studied eye for vulnerability. They hone in on small clues: someone who apologizes too quickly for minor misunderstandings, a person who rarely asks for help yet always offers it, friends who agree out of habit, or individuals reluctant to make waves even when wronged. These traits are not weaknesses in themselves, but in the sight of a determined manipulator, they signal an opening. The initial phase is subtle, even unremarkable. It can begin at a workplace social, where the most accommodating team member is given a last-minute deadline because you're always so supportive. Or in a family where the peacemaker is appointed permanent mediator, shouldering sibling conflicts or parental anxieties because you handle things so well. The manipulator gauges reactions, watching carefully for hesitation rather than protest, discomfort rather than refusal. One real-life scenario involves Zach, a talented graphic designer at a mid-sized firm. Though competent and amiable, he avoided conflict whenever possible. Recognizing this, his manager soon began forwarding complex projects his way, always couched in lavish praise about Zach's reliability and can-do attitude. With praise as the velvet glove, the iron hand of ever-increasing requests landed. Early morning revisions, late-night emergencies, tasks falling far outside his role's expectations. Each time Zach appeared hesitant, his manager's refrain was sweetly manipulative. "I know it's a lot, but we're counting on your dedication. You're not like the others. You don't let the team down." Zach's reluctance translated into guilt into compliance, and before long, what he thought was flexibility became a chronic pattern of overextension. Underneath what appeared mutual respect lived a quiet power imbalance, one built on the manager's masterful reading of Zach's willingness to sacrifice. In another scenario, Anna is the eldest daughter in a household with high emotional demands. From an early age, she was praised for maturity, for stepping in whenever her parents or younger siblings needed extra support. By her late 20s, Anna noticed she never truly spent holidays the way she wanted. She was always orchestrating, soothing, or rescuing family members from their crises. Every attempt to step back was greeted with admonishments, reminders of how much the family relied on her strong shoulders. This weight, disguised as affection and duty, became Anna's reality. The pattern extended to friendships, where she allowed others' priorities to eclipse her own, quietly resigning her wishes at every turn. Here again, the manipulator's mastery lay in exploiting Anna's sense of responsibility, translating her silence into ongoing permission. The psychological shifts at play are gradual yet powerful. A manipulated person's default setting shifts from self-reference to constant external calibration. Instead of asking what they want or need, their calculations revolve around how to avoid disappointing or displeasing others. Genuine preferences erode, replaced by reflexive compliance, draining self-trust one minor concession at a time. Victims experience an uneasy loyalty, where fear and guilt blend until advocating for oneself feels almost unthinkable. In effect, their boundaries become so porous that their inner life is shaped by the demands of others rather than their own. It is this pattern, targets identified, boundaries eroded, lives reshaped, that lies at the heart of emotional exploitation. To truly protect oneself, understanding the patterns and mechanisms is crucial. Only through this awareness can resistance begin. The next part will navigate how these dynamics intensify and loop, deepening victims' entrapment in often invisible cycles of control. Chapter 3: Saying No Without Fear. Late one evening, Daniel receives an unexpected message from his longtime friend Marcus. "I'm really stuck. Can you lend me some money? I wouldn't ask if I had any other option." The words are familiar, not because Daniel is particularly wealthy, but because he has always been the one who can't say no, even when the cost digs deep. As Daniel hovers over the reply button, he remembers the last time he drew a boundary. Marcus sent a flurry of messages laced with disappointment, questioning the strength of their friendship and Daniel's loyalty. Each interaction since has left Daniel feeling less like a friend and more like a lifeline. Marcus can tug at will. In these moments, the boundaries between support and obligation dissolve, and Daniel's personal welfare fades into the background, replaced by immediate compliance. The ultimate goal here is not just a borrowed sum. It is the assurance for Marcus that Daniel's yes is always available, no matter how heavy the price. Over time, the pattern entrenches itself. Saying no seems selfish or harsh, each refusal extracting an emotional toll that outweighs the discomfort of reluctant agreement. Manipulators like Marcus have refined their tactics. Disappointment is expressed, shared history weaponized, and guilt woven tightly enough that Daniel's urge to please overwhelms any flicker of resistance. In such dynamics, the victim's needs, priorities, and emotional resources are consistently dismissed. With every concession, Daniel forfeits a small measure of his self-respect and autonomy, and each time he acquiesces, the precedent strengthens. His value becomes tightly wound with how much he gives and how often he sacrifices his own comfort. The trap seldom becomes visible until the cost grows too great to ignore, savings depleted, trust eroded, well-being frayed by perpetual self-silencing. Daniel begins to see how his reluctance to refuse, rooted in fear of conflict, enables Marcus's persistent demands. What appears outwardly as kindness, loyalty, or being a good friend has in reality become an invisible shackle. The cycle operates quietly. Anticipation of guilt steers decisions, anxious overthinking muddles perspective, and each avoidance of a firm no is rewarded with temporary peace at the expense of personal boundaries. The need to protect the relationship overshadows the need to protect the self. This story is not rare. It echoes across workplaces where overextended employees say yes to overwhelming expectations, in families where caretakers carry burdens no one else will share, and in social circles where a single assertive voice is enough to silence quieter needs. Everyone who hesitates to say no has felt this chain. Small, seemingly trivial choices that strung together can shape an entire life's rhythm. For the manipulator, the ultimate prize is compliance without resistance. A supply of power cleverly maintained under the guise of friendship, love, or shared loyalty. The tragedy is that most Daniels only realize the cost when exhaustion and resentment finally break their silence, and by then saying no seems even more daunting, if not impossible. Beneath the surface of these interactions lies a hidden truth. The refusal to say no, born from fear of guilt, disappointment, or rejection, gradually trades one's self for someone else's version of loyalty. It is not only about the yes given, but the freedom and dignity surrendered, one quiet compromise at a time, until true autonomy is lost to the shadows of obligation. The inability to say no reaches far beyond a string of reluctant agreements. It becomes a quietly destructive force that seeps into every corner of emotional and psychological well-being. Emotionally, individuals who cannot refuse requests often experience an exhausting blend of anxiety, guilt, and resentment. Each acquiescence brings a brief moment of relief, but the aftermath is tense, an inner narrative that something essential has been lost. Over time, this festering emotional fatigue morphs into burnout, a condition well documented by psychologists working with chronic people-pleasers. Clinical case studies reveal patterns. Individuals like Daniel, who find themselves weary, sleepless, and even irritable, caught in an endless cycle of agreeing while privately longing for reprieve. The inability to say no is not merely inconvenient. It's an emotional tax quietly draining the heart of peace and fulfillment. Decision-making becomes painfully clouded under the shadow of anticipated judgment or disapproval. By living in fear of the manipulator's reaction, those who struggle with saying no longer navigate life from a compass of values or personal needs. Instead, every situation quickly becomes a calculation: how to minimize fallout, sidestep conflict, or avoid bearing the weight of disappointment. A teacher in one such study described this as counting emotional costs more carefully than checking actual finances. Eventually, important life decisions about work schedules, relationships, time allocation, even rest, are shaped more by others' agendas than by authentic self-direction. This pattern, according to research from the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, systematically undermines an individual's sense of agency and personal growth. Within relationships, chronic inability to refuse requests often sets the stage for lopsided patterns that cut away respect and trust. While on the surface these relationships might appear functional, underneath they become defined by unsaid agreements. One party gives, the other takes, and the ledger never balances. Deep connections transform into silent battlegrounds. Take the example of Rosalind and her adult daughter Mia, who returned home after college. Rosalind's compulsion to accommodate every request stemmed from a fear that saying no would erode her daughter's love. But as months passed, resentments grew, communication soured, and both Mia and Rosalind felt an alienation they could not voice. The giving, done without boundaries or honest refusal, killed the possibility of true intimacy and mutual respect. Psychology experts note these outcomes as hallmark consequences, wherever permission is so often granted that it loses all meaning. The erosion of self-esteem may be the most insidious consequence for those who never say no. Each capitulation silently confirms an internal verdict, that personal desires, needs, and limits matter less than the appeasement of others. In time, this undermines the bedrock of self-worth. Research consistently ties chronic compliance to a fragile, externally validated sense of value. People like Daniel or Rosalind start to perceive themselves as only worthy when liked, only safe when needed, only loved when agreed with. This breeds a dependency not just on external approval, but on the manipulator's willingness to grant acceptance. Why does this trap ensnare so many, even those who are otherwise bright and strong? The answer is complicated and rooted in early experiences, cultural pressures, and learned fears. Many are taught by parents, educators, or society that declining is unkind, selfish, or unloving. Manipulators skillfully wield tradition and guilt, camouflaging their demands as reasonable requests or familial loyalty. Each no seems to summon shame, while each yes temporarily keeps the peace. It becomes all too easy to conflate submission with virtue or equate silence with love. Yet beneath every instance of capitulation, there exists a battle for self-definition. The damage accumulates. The cost can be life-defining. Only by exposing the patterns, by seeing which cues and signals go unnoticed, does true resistance begin. The next part will unearth the subtle, overlooked warning signs that carry the greatest danger for those unable to say no. Manipulators searching for pliable targets rarely act without intention. They often scan their environments carefully for individuals whose personalities or histories make them particularly susceptible to guilt and persuasion. Ideal targets are not simply generous. They exhibit hesitancy when defending their needs, show discomfort expressing disagreement, or carry a visible anxiety about disappointing those around them. These cues, subtle as they may be, reveal a readiness to acquiesce. The manipulator will commonly start with small, seemingly harmless requests, watching for how quickly the target folds and how strong their inner resistance feels. If the yes comes too quickly or the no is timid and unsure, the cycle swiftly expands. Consider the case of Priya, a new intern in a bustling marketing agency. Fresh out of college, she was eager to be seen as helpful and eager, worrying that any act of refusal would be remembered as a mark against her character. Her supervisor began by asking for occasional coffee runs because you're so fast and trustworthy. When Priya complied without hesitation, the requests multiplied, staying late, running personal errands, handling additional tasks far outside her role. Each time Priya appeared hesitant or slightly overwhelmed but complied regardless, the supervisor's sense for her vulnerability sharpened. Soon, it was understood. If anyone in the department needed a favor or coverage, Priya would not argue. Like a slowly tightening net, the supervisor surrounded her with obligations while maintaining a facade of appreciation and dependability. A similar dynamic unfolds in social and familial contexts. Michael, the youngest son in an emotionally turbulent home, was raised to be the peacemaker. As an adult, his tendency to smooth over family conflicts made him the primary confidant and mediator during every disagreement, regardless of his own emotional state. Relatives grew accustomed to bringing problems to Michael, sure that he would never turn them away, and when he tried to reclaim time for himself, they deployed reminders of his special role, the glue that held everyone together. What seemed on the surface like trust or affection masked an ever-growing network of unspoken expectations. Michael's resistance faded as his worth anchored more firmly in constant compliance. The notion of saying no became synonymous with risk of isolation or rejection. These scenarios reveal a chilling pattern. A manipulator first locates softness, then gradually builds a script where the target's no feels costly, dangerous, or unthinkable. In many relationships, these shifts move so slowly they are almost invisible. The manipulated individual becomes hyper-attuned to other people's moods and needs, even predicting and forestalling conflict at their own expense. A small internal voice, once clear and steady, withers into anxious calculation. Should I agree again? Will they be disappointed if I don't? Self-worth becomes entwined with approval, eroding any genuine sense of agency. The longer the pattern persists, the steeper the cost to one's identity and autonomy. Understanding how manipulators identify and shape their targets is not just an academic exercise, it is critical for self-defense. Only by seeing the hidden strings can we form a plan to untangle them. This foundation of awareness paves the way for true resistance, which cannot begin until patterns are recognized and named. In the next part of this journey, the escalation of control will be exposed, revealing how the cycle hardens and deepens, often trapping victims until decisive action can be taken. Chapter 4: Standing Up for Yourself. Jenna sat at the dining table while her extended family discussed the next holiday gathering. The conversation seemed benign at first, but there was an insistent tone beneath her aunt's words. "We're all depending on you, Jenna, to make things work. Nobody has your patience or ability to organize these events," her aunt insisted, leaving no space for Jenna to refuse without feeling the sharp sting of disappointment from everyone around her. Years of similar interactions had conditioned Jenna to step forward automatically, taking charge regardless of her overflowing schedule or personal exhaustion. On the surface, it might look like simple family responsibility, but underneath there was a carefully honed game of manipulation masquerading as affection and flattery. The unspoken threat was unmistakable. If Jenna did not comply, she would disappoint loved ones, disrupt traditions, and expose herself to subtle scorn and icy silences. This scenario was about more than organizing a festive meal. The stakes were emotional control over Jenna, wrapped tightly in the illusion of family love. Every time she stepped forward to coordinate dinners, rides, and gift exchanges, her needs and limits faded into invisibility. The real goal for the manipulator, her aunt, and often her mother and siblings, was never to overwhelm Jenna for sport, but to ensure the family's machinery ran smoothly, no matter the cost to her well-being. The family claimed it was for the good of everyone, but what mattered most was keeping expectations intact and facing no discomfort or disruption themselves. Over years, Jenna became the axis around which everything spun, her own life plans compressed into the rigid shape of family demands. What Jenna and many others like her often fail to recognize is that standing up for oneself in these situations is not just about one instance of saying no. It's breaking the intricate web of manipulation crafted over time, where each prior act of acquiescence is used to increase compliance. Flattery blurs with guilt, and praise for doing so much becomes entanglement. As months and years pass, Jenna's autonomy withers. Standing up for herself begins to feel not only risky, but borderline traitorous. Victims fail to see the trap until the tension within them can no longer be reconciled. Sleepless nights, irritability, and the depletion that comes with always putting others ahead. The subtlety of this form of manipulation is its greatest strength. To an outsider, Jenna is a model of warmth and responsibility, while inside she is slowly eroding, fearful that asserting her own wishes will shatter her sense of belonging and even love. The cost of not standing up for herself grows incrementally, time that can never be reclaimed, ambitions buried by obligation, a voice grown faint from neglect. Yet this is how the cycle persists, almost perfectly hidden. Few dare question family or intimate groups, and fewer still confront the patterns that siphon away their time, peace, and identity. Manipulation disguised as tradition is an ancient web, one that cleverly protects itself by convincing its targets that refusing to participate is more dangerous than any sacrifice required of them. Standing up for oneself is cast as selfish, even though it is, in truth, the beginning of reclaiming a long-dormant freedom. Until the unspoken rules are named and challenged, the pattern will thrive, tight and silent, at the deepest corners of family and social life. The impact of not standing up for oneself goes far beyond temporary inconvenience. It quietly and methodically dismantles emotional health, corrodes confidence, and distorts relationships until a person barely recognizes their own needs and desires. Emotions in these cases rarely remain steady. Those perpetually pressed into roles of service like Jenna often develop chronic anxiety and persistent feelings of inadequacy. Even when others praise their selflessness, an uneasy undertow simmers. Resentment, frustration, and a deep longing to have their boundaries respected. Night after night, people in Jenna's position wrestle with unspoken anger and guilt, a mixture that leaves them drained and quietly hopeless as each new demand arrives. Research in the Journal of Interpersonal Psychology confirms that continuous self-suppression triggers not only anxiety and depression, but also somatic symptoms, frequent headaches, exhaustion, and even elevated rates of illness. Decision-making becomes tangled as the person's internal compass loses its bearings. Rather than asking, "What do I want?" their thoughts spiral around anticipatory guilt and a forecast of disappointment from those around them. A simple choice, whether to take a weekend alone, decline a project, or even decide what to have for dinner, becomes fraught with imagined reprisals and battles with self-doubt. Consider the case of Alex, who grew up in a household where saying no led to icy distance from his parents. As an adult, Alex agreed to every request at work and in his circle of friends, shifting plans, accepting late assignments, running errands, or abandoning personal interests, until the sensation of making any independent decision became foreign and uncomfortable. He described a constant interrogation in his mind. Was he disappointing someone, failing someone, being too difficult? Over time, every outward maybe concealed an internal no that never found its voice. Relationships warped by chronic accommodation fall into predictable, destructive dynamics. While Jenna's family can point to her as the reliable centerpiece of their harmony, the love they give is conditional, flowing only as long as she continues to comply. A similar story played out for Thomas, a volunteer president of his condominium association, who was constantly praised for his involvement. Every once in a while, when Thomas dared to speak up against an unfair request or reinforce sensible limits, others turned cool, distanced themselves, or led subtle whisper campaigns criticizing his commitment. Thomas soon learned that peace was achievable only through endless compromise. Over time, the growing realization that his value depended on constant performance deeply eroded his trust in others' affection or companionship. This erosion gnaws most viciously at self-esteem. The inability or outright fear of standing up for oneself signals again and again that personal feelings matter less. External needs take precedence. Over time, this belief becomes an internalized axiom. Victims question not just whether their needs are acceptable, but whether they themselves are worthy of basic respect or happiness. Psychological research consistently connects this dynamic with diminished self-worth and eventually emotional dependence on others. Validation. People fall for these patterns because standing up for oneself has, in many environments, come to be mislabeled as arrogance, selfishness, or even betrayal. Cultural narratives and family histories echo with stories extolling ultimate sacrifice, glorifying silent suffering as love, loyalty, or duty. Manipulators are quick to reinforce these ideas, linking their own comfort and emotional needs to a victim's compliance. In many groups, the consequences of resistance, withdrawn affection, icy silence, or thinly veiled disapproval, can feel unbearable. The cost for asserting even basic boundaries is made to look like unhealable loss, so most people shrink away from it, and the cycle deepens. Understanding what is truly at risk is the first act of awakening. Only by seeing these mechanisms clearly can people hope to recover a sense of self-respect and autonomy. Yet what makes these cycles so tenacious are the subtle warning signs, so often overlooked, that herald another round of compliance. The next part will bring these hidden markers to the surface, equipping you with insight that is essential for reclaiming your own voice. Manipulators are not looking for the loudest person in the room. They seek those who already show signs of self-doubt, habitual peacemaking, or chronic guilt over setting limits. The subtle way they select their targets almost resembles an unspoken game of observation. They pay close attention to who offers to help before being asked, who apologizes for inconveniences others might brush off, and who appears most unsettled by conflict or tension. Vulnerability is not always obvious. Often it reveals itself through consistent self-correction, hesitation in speech, and automatic accommodation. The manipulator learns to test the boundaries of their target's compliance. A minor request becomes slightly larger on the next round, and each act of acquiescence emboldens the manipulator further. The target, meanwhile, grows accustomed to the idea that standing up for oneself is either pointless or fraught with disproportionate risk. This can be traced through scenarios like Emma's. She joined her local volunteer board brimming with ideas, but quickly became the person who took on leftover tasks no one else wanted. The board president soon noticed that Emma rarely turned down a responsibility, no matter how unfair the distribution became. She received polished praise and public thank yous, but when she quietly questioned whether others were shouldering enough, the response was a collective coldness, a subtle but unmistakable cue of her place. Driven by a need to redeem this loss of harmony, Emma fell in line, internalizing each refusal as a moral shortcoming. Over months, the dynamic solidified. Emma became not just the board's hardest worker, but also its primary source of emotional labor, diffusing tension after meetings and patching over conflicts. Unspoken agreements formed. If a special event needed a leader or a new project demanded overtime, she was the obvious candidate. The manipulation was so deft that Emma herself began to question whether she was selfish for even feeling exploited. In family relationships, the pattern emerges just as clearly. Samuel, a middle son in a large household, was chosen to be the buffer between his combative siblings and demanding parents. Years of quiet deference earned him a reputation as the reasonable one, always fair, level-headed, never troublesome. What this really meant was that Samuel's own aspirations and needs quietly slipped out of sight. When Samuel hesitated to mediate another sibling argument, his parents responded with a heartbreaking disappointment, sometimes retreating into silence until he relented. This method, never overt, rarely cruel, anchored Samuel in a role that became his full identity. The gradual psychological impact is devastating. What starts as wanting to be helpful, generous, or easygoing hardens into a relentless pattern of self-neglect and fear of confrontation. The person on the receiving end begins to distrust their own perceptions, accepting mistreatment as the normal price of belonging or approval. Internal dialogue changes. Questions of fairness or justice give way to justifications and rationalization. At the same time, self-worth grows contingent on the avoidance of conflict, making future acts of self-assertion increasingly difficult. Gaining clarity on these tactics is fundamental for breaking free. When you recognize the method, the grooming for compliance, the escalation of small demands, the policing of dissent through isolation or disappointment, you start to understand that standing up for yourself is not selfish, but necessary for genuine connection and well-being. Only through clear-eyed knowledge can resistance begin. The next stage will examine how, once patterns are established, they escalate into deeper cycles of dependence and entrapment, sometimes making escape feel out of reach until the pattern is fully exposed. Chapter 5. Speaking honestly and kindly. Waiting in the hallway for the meeting to end, Alex rehearses his response over and over in his mind. He needs to talk to his project lead, Marcia, about constantly being handed unreasonable deadlines for his share of tasks, even when other colleagues have more flexibility. When he has tried to explain his workload before, Marcia responded with airy dismissals. "You always get it done." "I knew I could trust you to handle the pressure," she'd say, veiling her expectations with flattery. She would often add how much the team counted on his reliability, or how a setback in his part would affect everyone else's performance. It was a web of compliments and dire warnings, spun so delicately that Alex felt both pride and anxiety, eager to not let anyone down even as resentment brewed quietly inside him. Over months, the manipulation deepened as Marcia inflected every conversation with layers of implied obligation. When Alex gently raised objections in team meetings, she interrupted him, steering the dialogue away or suggesting they speak privately. Alone, the tone changed, never accusing outright but lacing concern with implied criticism. "I hear you're struggling. That's not like you. Are you sure everything's all right at home?" These subtle redirections cloaked emotional control and compliance beneath a veneer of kindness, making it harder and harder for Alex to be truthful without being made to seem fragile, uncooperative, or at risk of personal shortcomings. He questioned his perceptions, worried that directness would damage his reputation or make him seem ungrateful in the eyes of others. Marcia's goal was compliance, disguised as team spirit, yet she also quietly reinforced social isolation. With every instance Alex tried to speak honestly, even about small issues, she deflected or undermined his viewpoint, sometimes without his noticing. It became easiest for him to avoid raising any truth that might disrupt the group harmony. Over time, she exploited this by privately suggesting to others that Alex wanted to take on extra but just needed a little encouragement, reframing his exhaustion as enthusiasm. In doing so, she erased his boundaries while keeping him ensnared in roles he never agreed to. Alex's sense of self faded among layers of artifice, his hopes of straightforward, genuine communication dashed. Most people, like Alex, do not realize the extent of the entrapment until the consequences become painfully obvious. Crumbling motivation, distrust in the sincerity of feedback, alienation from peers, and near total silence about their own emotional life or limits. What started as a desire to be seen as kind, fair, and supportive was gradually twisted into a trap, where his every word had to be measured lest he disappoint, spark resentment, or seem inferior. The intricate blend of flattery, guilt, and redirected concern was psychological manipulation at its most refined and its most dangerous. Being honest and kind had turned from strengths into landmines, weaponized by those who understood precisely how to exploit vulnerability under the guise of civility. Without realizing it, many drift ever further from clear, candid self-expression, until even the idea of speaking a truth with kindness feels like an impending threat rather than a basic right. The erosion of honest, kind communication, in the presence of psychological manipulation, quietly hollows out a person's sense of self and safety. On the emotional level, individuals like Alex commonly find themselves sinking into a fog of persistent anxiety and self-doubt. They second-guess even the smallest words, anticipating that directness, no matter how gently expressed, may be twisted or used against them. Emotional exhaustion mounts as the internal conflict between wanting to be truthful and the fear of hostile consequences escalates. It becomes less about what is actually said and more about what must be swallowed. Over time, bottled-up feelings lead to frustration, irritability, and chronic stress, with studies in occupational psychology linking suppressed self-expression to increased rates of burnout and emotional detachment from roles once enjoyed. Decision-making likewise suffers in subtle yet profound ways. A person entrapped by manipulative leadership, as in Alex's situation, begins to approach every choice from a place of anticipatory defense rather than constructive intent. A simple conversation involves strategizing, how to phrase concerns so they sound neither critical nor vulnerable, rehearsing statements in hopes of minimizing backlash or disapproval. This constant mental maneuvering has been thoroughly documented by researchers in the field of organizational behavior, where emotion labor is a recognized phenomenon. The capacity for straightforward, timely decision-making erodes as choices are filtered not through one's actual needs or beliefs, but through the likely perception of the manipulator. The fear of repercussions, isolation, or loss of standing can paralyze a person's voice, rendering even crucial feedback nearly impossible to share. Relationships are perhaps most painfully distorted when manipulation is allowed to discourage clear dialogue. What should be collaboration turns into a hierarchy of silence. In the case of Alex, his friendship and collegial ties grew increasingly perfunctory because honesty felt risky. Others began to treat him as the reliable worker bee, available and efficient but emotionally distant. The loss of trust and rapport isolates both sides, those who feel silenced and those who remain unaware they are complicit in that silence. In family situations, a similar mechanism plays out. Children or partners learn to tiptoe around core issues to keep the peace, Unspoken resentments accumulate, and genuine closeness is replaced by polite performance. The slow degradation of trust and intimacy in these circumstances has been confirmed by numerous longitudinal studies on family dynamics. Once honest exchange breaks down, every other part of the relationship starts to falter. Self-esteem is quietly battered by repeated invalidation or negation. Not only are the victim's preferences and boundaries ignored, but their reality itself receives covert rejection over time. Stephanie, for instance, recalled that raising even constructive, gently worded concerns to her partner always led to avoiding eye contact, distracted sighs, or "let's not do this right now." With enough repetition, she lost faith in her perceptions entirely. Research routinely finds that those denied honest, kind voices become dependent on external feedback and ultimately doubt their judgment and worth. Why do such damaging patterns persist? Many are taught through culture and upbringing that kindness must always take the form of silence, deference, or self-sacrifice. Manipulators, skilled at reading signals of insecurity or appeasement, reinforce this lesson by responding to truth-telling with coldness, guilt, or isolating backlash. Over time, the cost of honesty appears to be connection itself. The suffering may be quiet and mostly invisible from the outside, but the internal war is brutal and ongoing. Recognizing the devastating consequences of these blocked truths is vital for anyone seeking self-liberation. Yet the signs of manipulation are often expertly camouflaged beneath courtesy, flattery, or false harmony. The next section will pierce this veil by exposing the subtle, easily missed warnings that too often go unrecognized until self-expression is a distant memory. Manipulators seeking to control communication quickly pick up on those who hesitate before sharing their honest perspectives. They notice who nervously scans the room before speaking up, whose words are peppered with qualifiers or apologies, and who avoids confrontation, even on trivial matters. The act of identifying a target is methodical. Manipulators watch for individuals who want to be liked, who naturally compromise their opinions, or who silence themselves to maintain peace. These qualities, while sometimes mistaken for diplomacy or tact, signal an opportunity. The manipulator's goal is to cultivate doubt about the value or appropriateness of honest, kind communication, making it safer for the victim to stay silent than risk conflict. This process is sharply illustrated in the experience of Leah, a marketing assistant in a mid-sized agency. Early in her tenure, Leah contributed thoughtful suggestions during team meetings. Her supervisor responded with lukewarm praise, subtly redirecting the discussion or ignoring her input altogether. Later, he would approach her privately and point out, "Your ideas are good, but be careful. They can sound a bit naive, and not everyone appreciates honesty the way you do." Gradually, Leah internalized the message. Frankness had consequences, even when coated with kindness. After months of muted reactions, occasional subtle ridicule, and whispered warnings from peers about not rocking the boat, Leah found her willingness to speak openly shriveling up. The next time she had a concern, she reasoned with herself that it was better to hold back, avoid causing a stir, and retain the fragile camaraderie she'd managed to build. Her sense of herself as insightful and creative quietly dimmed in the shadows of caution and self-doubt. A similar scenario played out in Michael's long-term relationship. Early disagreements, if voiced too directly, were met by his partner's disapproving silence or veiled sighs, followed by emotional withdrawal. Over time, Michael learned that any form of honest but compassionate feedback would transform intimacy into distance. His internal monologue became a maze of second-guessing and tentative rewording, always careful not to disrupt an equilibrium that ran on his silence. The manipulator did not need to shout, just a glance, a subtle rebuke, or a deflection was enough to tilt the balance. With each encounter, Michael grew more attentive to every mood shift, fearful of saying the wrong thing. The part of himself that craved truthful and gentle connection slowly starved. The psychological shifts induced by such tactics run deep. Individuals targeted in this way come to equate kindness with self-censorship and sincere communication with personal risk. Their instinct is no longer to engage directly but to seek the safest path, one often defined by omission, avoidance, and compliance. This gradual accommodation erodes confidence, shrinking even the urge to share good news or mild opinions unless absolute safety can be guaranteed. Self-doubt replaces natural self-expression. Basic conversation feels like a gauntlet, dangerous even when navigated softly. Recognizing these manipulative methods for what they are is essential for self-defense. When you see the dynamic, how hesitant openness is rewarded by evasion, redirection, or subtle put-downs, you begin to name the fog that has clouded your communication. You are no longer left wondering whether your desire for authentic, kind dialogue belongs or not. Instead, you see that suppression has been learned, never inherent. Understanding this is your first real point of resistance. The following section will dig deeper into the escalations that often follow, exploring how these entrenched patterns of stifled expression can bind victims in even tighter loops of control and silence. Chapter 6. Feeling Free and in Control. As the sun dipped below the skyline, Rachel stared at her phone, reading the same message for the 5th time. Her partner, David, had spent months defining their social outings, their finances, even her day-to-day routines. At first, these gestures masqueraded as care. David wanted to share bank accounts to make things easier, picked her friends for her by commenting which were a good influence, and even volunteered to sort her free time so she could relax more. Every preference, boundary, or instinct that clashed with his structure seemed to disappoint him. So Rachel quietly adjusted her choices until arguments disappeared. It was an incremental reshaping of her life, done so gently that she never marked the disappearance of her own dreams. The deeper she slipped into compliance, the more David etched the rules, not just of their partnership, but of Rachel's very identity. She enabled the gradual takeover, telling herself she was being practical and loving. Each time she suppressed the discomfort in her chest, she lost a little more of herself. The reality, painfully obvious in hindsight but rendered invisible through daily repetition, was nothing less than a campaign of psychological manipulation. David's ultimate goal was complete emotional control, rooted not in wild jealousy or overt force, but in rewards and warnings so subtle their influence went unquestioned. Underneath every helpful intervention lay an unspoken contract: freedom for peace, individuality for approval. By orchestrating social interactions, controlling shared money, and shaping Rachel's responses to fit his needs, David crafted both dependency and social isolation. His careful molding created a world where Rachel would no longer feel secure making decisions without checking first if they would work for him or the relationship. She interpreted this arrangement as partnership for so long that the architecture of her entrapment only truly emerged once the cost had become irreversible. This sort of manipulation thrives on invisibility. Victims fail to recognize the pattern because it is laid down brick by brick, each concession disguised as love or necessity. It becomes normal for them to wait for approval before choosing how to spend an evening, accept someone else's budgeting as stewardship rather than oversight, or automatically decline an invitation if their partner hesitates. In Rachel's situation, any assertive move toward independence was received not only as a personal affront to David, but as destabilizing to their supposed harmony. Each attempt at freedom incurred silent fees: cold looks, sighs, warnings about being selfish, and finally threats of withdrawing affection or escalating tension at home. Over time, the urge to avoid this discomfort overwhelms the spirit. What's most insidious is that Rachel and others in her position seldom see these shackles for what they are until energy, confidence, and spirit have thinned to the point where even imagining change feels audacious. The tragedy is that Rachel's journey is echoed by so many, their experiences muted by shame or confusion, barely distinguishable from the rhythms of normal life. The transition from self-sovereignty to caged compliance seems unremarkable until the door clicks shut, and then even the air feels rationed. It is in this quiet, aching truth that the meaning of feeling free and in control, not only over logistics but over one's soul, begins to shine as something more fundamental than any agreement or compromise. This chapter peels back that facade, revealing how manipulative architecture builds its prisons in plain sight, and why the restoration of agency is the only path to a life authentically lived. The cost of relinquishing control and freedom, even when cloaked in the softness of partnership or apparent practicality, slices deeply into emotional well-being. Victims like Rachel often develop a persistent, quiet anxiety, the kind that arises from having to anticipate the moods, preferences, or unspoken rules set by someone else. Such controlling manipulation breeds an atmosphere in which self-doubt is constant. Rachel spends her days wondering, will this choice be met with support or disappointment? Even small steps, a spontaneous phone call to a friend, a personal purchase, an evening out, become fraught with anticipatory tension. That constant need for approval drains vital energy, replacing natural confidence with a paralyzing self-consciousness. Decision-making is fundamentally altered in these circumstances. As the boundaries of personal freedom shrink, choices no longer reflect inner desires or priorities, but are filtered through the framework of maintaining harmony and safety. Instead of Rachel asking what she wants from life, every decision is reframed by preemptive questions. Will David like this? Will it avoid conflict? Will it secure a quiet evening? Eventually, autonomy dissolves. Rachel begins habitually translating her instincts into rehearsed lines that mirror her partner's expectations. In her case, giving up control to avoid friction felt at first like keeping the peace, but with every deferred decision, she traded her independence for a tenuous sense of calm. Research in the American Journal of Community Psychology highlights this shift often leads to learned helplessness, where individuals no longer believe in their capacity to effect change or pursue authentic choices, undermining all ambitions and dreams. Relationships themselves become distorted and brittle when a dynamic of control replaces reciprocal respect. Rachel's partnership began to resemble a transfusion of energy that always flowed one way, from her to David, draining her connection to herself, her friends, and even those family members who voiced concern. Genuine intimacy is eroded by the manipulator's constant reinforcement that only compliance earns approval. When freedom is lost, so too is the space for honest emotional exchange, vulnerability, or shared laughter. Instead, obedience masquerades as togetherness, but the real relationship is with the illusion, a dance where one leads and the other is never allowed to improvise. Similar dynamics are seen in controlling friendships and workplaces, all yielding the same hollowing disconnection from any source of genuine support or joy. Self-esteem withers away as well, the slow casualty of ceaseless deference and self-editing. No matter how competent or independent a person once felt, the seeds of manipulation spawn persistent doubt. Maybe I'm not strong enough to be on my own. Maybe I need someone else's order. Over time, praise becomes rare, efforts unrewarded, and questions about one's judgment linger long after the manipulator's voice has faded. In case studies, individuals who have escaped such relationships describe a jarring realization. Their interests, personalities, and even voices seemed hushed or deleted, echoes of the fearful compliance that once felt necessary for survival. Why are these traps so effective? Often the answer is a tragic confluence of hope, love, and the human inclination toward compromise. Manipulators excel at camouflaging control as care and presenting restrictions as practical solutions to ordinary life. Targets, meanwhile, hold to early moments of gentleness, believing surrender is temporary or for the greater good. Family upbringing, messages about selflessness, and collective narratives of partnership further erode the natural instinct to fight for one's own agency. Recognizing what has been lost, how manipulation distorts spirit and suppresses freedom, is the beginning of return. But the greatest risk is that this distortion can be so skillfully hidden. The next part will pull back the final layer, revealing the subtle indicators of lost control and the invisible lines most people cross long before they realize what's truly at stake. Manipulators intent on cultivating control and diminishing another's sense of freedom rarely act impulsively. Instead, they are highly observant, patient, and skilled at locating those whose boundaries are flexible or whose need for harmony can be redirected into compliance. They attune themselves to small hesitations, a partner who seldom chooses the restaurant, a friend who apologizes first even when wronged, or an employee who routinely defers to the group rather than voice an independent plan. In the beginning, the manipulator offers protection, solutions, or help, all ways to position themselves as indispensable. Yet these gestures are not acts of kindness, but deliberate trials designed to test for resistance, to measure how easily another's agency can be redirected or managed. Observe the relationship established between Layla and her college roommate, Naomi. During their first semester, Naomi positioned herself as a kind of guide in unfamiliar terrain. She coordinated errands, drafted daily routines, and scheduled activities, saying it took the burden off Layla. At first, Layla interpreted all of this as generosity and efficiency. Gently, Naomi began to comment on Layla's friendships and wardrobe, suggesting some friends were draining or certain styles weren't practical for student life. No arguments erupted. Instead, every suggestion slipped beneath Layla's radar, triggering small accommodations, a different outfit here, a missed call to a friend there, all in pursuit of household harmony. Naomi grew bolder. Soon Layla deferred on even personal decisions, waiting for feedback or advice before committing to plans for herself. The subtle psychological shifts accompanying this process are profound and deeply internalized. Layla once felt free-spirited and independent. After several months, uncertainty crept into her every thought. What if she upset Naomi? How would an independent choice affect their living arrangement? Guilt was a constant undertone, magnified by every effort she made to please. Bit by bit, Layla lost confidence in her instincts. Her inner dialogue transformed from, "What is best for me?" to, "Will this keep us on good terms?" The loss of freedom for the illusion of comfort and safety was gradual but devastating. The freedom of choosing meals, keeping friendships, and finding her style was quietly traded for approval and peace, a compromise that strangled her individuality. In professional settings, the playbook is equally effective. Marcus, a valuable analyst at his firm, watched his autonomy shrink as his supervisor began offering to lighten his load. Tasks were redistributed, meetings were streamlined, and Marcus's calendar filled with priorities chosen by others. The change was so incremental, he only recognized it when he realized he no longer set his own goals or found time for creative work. Work that used to inspire was now managed, measured, and predetermined by what fit the vision of the team. It was much later that Marcus pieced together how his willingness to accept guidance was translated, slowly, into relinquished power. These examples are sobering, and their seriousness underscores the gravity of recognizing such manipulation. Knowledge of these patterns is the first, unavoidable step toward taking back autonomy. That quiet erasure of personal preference and authentic choice may not scream for attention, but when viewed through the lens of self-defense, it becomes a red siren demanding change. Understanding these methods prepares the mind to question the invisible scripts and calibrate emotional instincts, arming you against further encroachment. Awareness is a decisive act of resistance. When you can identify who seeks flexible boundaries and why, you stand closer to breaking their cycle of control. In the next part, the escalation of these tactics will be examined, how the loss of freedom often leads to deeper cycles, where reclaiming control feels harder with each passing compromise. The patterns may be subtle, but knowing them is the beginning of reclaiming a truly liberated and self-determined life. In exploring the intricate realities of guilt manipulation and boundary breaking, this book has illuminated how exploitation hides within daily life and shaped a path toward reclaiming strength and autonomy. From learning to spot subtle controls to building healthy boundaries, saying no without fear, and confidently speaking your truth, each chapter has revealed the urgent steps to escape cycles of compliance and rediscover your authentic self. Thank you for investing your time to gain this crucial understanding. If this journey has resonated with you, please like, comment, and subscribe to Stealth Psychology for more insights and support on your path to personal freedom.